The Toronto home series marks the final regular season event of the Call of Duty League, and boy, will it be a fun way to close it out, as the top 4 teams in the standings will be competing for the top 2 seeds coming into champs, that being the Chicago Huntsmen, Dallas Empire, Atlanta FaZe, and Florida Mutineers. Funny enough, if you haven't already seen it, 3 out of the 4 of these teams will actually all be in the same pool, excluding the Huntsmen. The Mutineers, FaZe, and Empire, alongside the Rocker, will make up Group B for the Toronto home series, and arguably the most difficult group of the entire season. Not just because of the teams, but also because of the level of these teams at this point in the season. And that's the reason why, for me, it is so influential to talk about kind of the groups now, because there have been, conversations earlier, and there could be, certain, groups of old or even, past home series where you could make arguments and say, oh, well, this group is harder based on the teams. But whenever you look at the teams now, and in terms of how that skill gap has slowly, or I should say slowly, but kind of now decreased over time, you have to be aware of how close a lot of these teams are and how much of how I'll say this, how kind of small the difference is between different strategies, et cetera, et cetera. So let's kind of get to breaking this one down a little bit. We'll kind of go in order of the bracket. The first team we're going to talk about in Group B for the Toronto home series is, in fact, the Atlanta FaZe, right? Last time that we saw them, they were getting 3-0'd by the Huntsmen in what was going to be the most hyped match of the year, or if not one of the most hyped matches of the year, the one series that everybody was relying on coming into the New York home series, and it was not at all that exciting. And people forget, prior to that series, in the same event, FaZe ended up losing to the Toronto Ultra in a Game 5. Granted, they've kind of been the Game 5 kings, but they've ultimately started to look more human, right? The Atlanta FaZe, at one point at the start of the year, I remember receiving tweets and even seeing different Reddit threads talking on, will Atlanta FaZe lose an event this year? Like, that was the conversation that we had around, I don't know, maybe the 3rd or 4th event on LAN. It was that, can this Atlanta FaZe team actually lose? Are they capable of getting taken down? And like I said, I remember getting tweets talking on, is this actually possible? How will teams kind of start to form around the strategies and just the overall dominance from the Atlanta FaZe? And it is fair to say teams have started, if not already, they have caught up, right? Teams have started to hard counter them in search and destroy, right? This Atlanta FaZe team, considered to be the best search and destroy team in the world, they have lost 5 out of their last 6 search and destroys that they've played. Now, we're talking kind of negatively on the Atlanta FaZe. We have to put this in retrospect a little bit, right? In light of that, in light of teams catching up, in light of teams playing them closer, taking them down, FaZe kind of losing series that they probably should have won, going to Game 5s, all of those things, they've still been placing well, right? Second place, top 4. It's not the placements that they are happy with, but it is placements from an overall outward perspective that you could look at and say, they're still good, right? They're still not a bad team by any means. It's just that they are more capable of losing. And there have been a lot of conversations that analysts have properly had about how they're making the game harder for themselves in respawns. And I think that's going to be one major testament kind of for the rest of the season, is how are they going to kind of improve the little minute details. They have the slang, it's just a matter of putting it in the right direction. Now the team they're going to be facing off against, the next roster in this group, the Minnesota Rocker, right? A team that by no means has had the greatest of stretches. By far the best team that has taken the biggest hit. In their last 4 events, they have finished top 6, top 8, and top 8. GodRx went from being my MVP candidate at the time in the season. I was saying, GodRx, he is the MVP of the CDL, and that was during a short time. And then after we've transferred to online, he has not looked like the same player, constantly going negative, not having that same impact. The 1.2s have turned into 0.8s and 0.9s. It's not the same slang that the Minnesota Rocker could rely on. And at one point, there was a conversation that people were having with the Minnesota Rocker saying, you know what? Maybe Asim should be the one out the door. And Asim right now is carrying the load, right? When it came down to the New York home series, he had the highest KD on this team just over Assault, and he was using the M4 more, right? He was having success with the weapon that you'd expect someone like GodRx to have success with. Another player that has kind of seen a major decrease in terms of just overall slang, Alex. And that could possibly be because of the injury, but he went from being a top 5, if not top 10 guaranteed player to having the worst KD at the New York home series with a 0.65. And I'm not 100% sure, again, if it's injury, what really the case is for him, but needless to say, they are losing a lot from the dynamic duo they had at the start of the season. It was GodRx and it was Alex, and obviously we're seeing guys like Assault kind of step up to the plate. The team's been playing well. You're looking at those two for sure for Minnesota here. Now, I will say they have lost some close series and have faced off against some good teams. I think they are better than their results kind of indicate, but I don't know how much better, right? I'm not sure exactly how much credit that I can give the Minnesota Rocker right now, given the most recent placements. And I'll be honest, I think for this event, and specifically for champs, they need to change their identity. And I can kind of talk about this at a later time, but I think that the Rocker need to change their identity. They were a methodical team at the start of the year. They were a smart team to start off the CDL, and a lot of people are kind of crediting that to most likely the reason why they were so good. But I think they need to focus their attention on Search and Destroy. Become a one respawn roster, and I think that's where they can start to see a lot of success. We just saw Paris do it. Maybe the Minnesota Rocker could do it as well. Now, the next team in this group, Florida Mutineers, coming off of a very interesting performance at the London home series. First one, go Game 5, Round 11 with the new OGLA lineup. In fact, in their first ever official match of having Draza and Hollow. Later on, obviously, they win the Game 5, Round 11. They then, the next series over, get reverse swept by the London Royal Ravens. And by the way, I was actually casting this series. I thought it was done. I thought it was totally over at this point, because when we talked about this particular map and mode, this has been the bread and butter for the Mutineers. They lose a St. Petro domination to a team who is by no means confident in domination, right? If there were to be one team in particular who tries to avoid domination, one of those rosters has to be the Ravens, and so that they win it on, I believe it was Florida's map choice, of which they are previously 9-1 on this, and that is the catalyst that starts the reverse sweep. They constantly threw away advantages kind of throughout that series in particular, and they would later get 3-0'd by the Empire in a series that many predicted was going to go to a Game 5. I thought it was going to go to a Game 5. I'm pretty sure almost everyone thought there's no way this is going to be a 3-0. There's no way this is going to be a dominant 3-0, and it was. It was not close. Now, before this, we have to remember, right? Before this specific event, these guys were golden, right? I mean, people have already started to kind of forget the dominance that this Mutineer team had, right? They looked better, in terms of their prior events. They go back-to-back for the first time in the CDL. They were undefeated with this lineup after 2 events of having Awakening in the lineup. They had yet to lose coming into the London home series. They were dominating teams in respawns. They were cleaning up their Search and Destroy. Everybody looked to be on point. And now the question remains, can they bounce back? Right after the performance that we saw, what's the difference here? Right, we've gone from one weekend to the next, and it is a totally different Mutineer-looking team. Granted, they had a little bit of a break, but nonetheless, where are they going to be at? Right, what rather can we kind of expect from the Mutineers right now? And finally, the last team to make up this group for Toronto, the Dallas Empire. Really, kind of the only team with somewhat of a positive story directly coming into this event, as they looked very, very convincing as they won the London home series in the most dominant fashion that we have seen a team win a home series all year long. They go 12-1 in maps. The next highest was 12-3, done by a multitude of different teams. They averaged a 60-point hardpoint victory. They averaged a 30-point domination win. These guys were rolling, and their only loss came from Paris in their very first game, Search and Destroy on Gunrunner. I believe it was 6-4, and they later go on to play them in the Search and Destroy in the finals, and Dallas takes it pretty easily. So I'll say this about the Dallas Empire. They close out the tournament, not just in an impressive manner, not just based off of maps, but you also have to consider the fact that they take down the other 2 top dogs for this event as well, right? They take down the hot-looking subliner team, right? The roster that was on a 12-map streak coming into their series. The team that a lot of people thought, all right, the subliners, they're throwing their hat in the ring. They could be maybe that fifth-place team that can start to kind of, be a contender from time to time. They 3-0 them. Then they go on to face off against the Mutineers, which you've already talked about it. A dominant 3-0. No map was close. Empire rolled them as well. And at the same time of these victories, we also saw probably the most collaborative effort all year long from the Empire. And, kind of their previous victories. Rambo's talked about it on State of the Empire, how a few of their wins this season have come from, kind of the Game 5 situations, maybe winning a tournament or not facing off against the highest caliber of talent, right? They face off against the Rocker to get their first W. You talk about different teams where they've still had that success. This by far was their most dominant victory, and we saw a major increase from players like Crim6 and Illy, and they look to be more of a well-rounded team. All right. Now we kind of know where everyone's position is. Let's kind of get into these matches specifically. We'll hit on these just lightly for a moment, just to kind of give predictions. First match we're going to see in terms of this group, if we're looking at it, is going to be FaZe versus Rocker, right? Minnesota at one point were known as FaZe's kryptonite. You have to keep in mind they haven't played since LA, right? We're thinking pre-COVID, or at least pre-COVID affecting the league. So it's been a long time since that's taken place. FaZe, despite the struggles, like I said, have still placed well. Both teams don't often win or lose 3-0, so this probably has the ability to go 3-1 or 3-2, depending on how good the Rocker can kind of perform. But I like Atlanta. You have to like Atlanta when it comes down to this series. Granted, they have lost some series to teams like Toronto of old, but nonetheless, they clean up their search and destroys, and I think they'll walk away with this versus the Rocker. Next one we have Empire versus the Mutineers, right? We just saw this series happen in London. It was not close. From when I talked to Illy, he told me that they nailed the veto process in this one, or at least in their prior engagement. We'll see how that kind of takes place here in Toronto. I don't think the Mutineers are as bad as the 3-0 that they suffered versus the Empire, and I think that they still have the ability to catch fire and make it out of this group. But I'm going with the team that I think is the most well-prepared in the CDL right now. They're coming off of a win just a few days ago, and that has been the major conversation for teams like Florida. When they went back-to-back, they went from one weekend to the next, and I feel like the Empire also could have that same effect on their gameplay. They're confident versus the Mutineers, and I think if Florida really wants to make this a close one, they're going to have to win the Game 1 hardpoint. Again, it's not going to be easy, especially versus a team like the Empire, who just had everybody slay out. Their lowest KD at the most recent event was a 1.15. So we kind of move on. We're talking about placements. We're talking about teams moving on. We'll go to the losers bracket now. This would be losers round 1. I would have Rocker versus Florida. I'll be honest, I've got Florida. I've got the Mutineers for this one. They historically play very well when it comes down to their second series. Kind of their old roster, if you will. Florida kind of throughout a lot of the season. They tend to lose the first series, come back strong in the second one. That doesn't necessarily apply to the Awakening team, but a high majority of this team has been involved in moments like that. I think that this could be the series where they start to catch fire and take down a once great Rocker team. Rocker, again, I would like to kind of try to make this a close series, but I just think in general, Florida, they're going to start to steamroll. This is where they're going to start to kind of get back in form. All right, winners round 2. This would be for the first seed of this pool in a massive game when we talk about champ seeding, Empire versus FaZe. I'll say this, like I said, whoever wins this gets a massive advantage because you have to think about whoever wins this plays the second seed from the other group. And the second seed from the other group by no means is as solid when we talk about overall placements in terms of who will probably be the first seed, which is going to be Chicago most likely. Whoever wins this gets a massive advantage. You could argue they get a ticket to the finals if they win this because they'll have to play either Toronto or OGLA most likely. So again, I think when we talk about this series, it's going to be a tough one. FaZe have kind of had the Empire number a lot throughout the season, but we have seen Dallas start to fire back as of late. I think that FaZe have the ability to make this a very close series, and I think both teams match up, very similar as well, right? Teams that can be good in respawn, but search and destroy is kind of their bread and butter. I think based off the recent performance from the Empire, based on how smart that they have been playing, I think that even if FaZe comes through and they have a more kind of slay-heavy roster, I think the Empire know how to deal with it, and for that reason, I give them the victory. I think Empire win this particular match, and they get the first seed. So, now that we're kind of heading down to the losers round 2 side, it will then be the Atlanta FaZe and my predictions facing off against the Florida Mutineers. And this one is a hard one to call, right? Because based off of what I think, Florida Mutineers, they win versus the Rocker. How convincing is that? That's going to be a major question. I think the biggest issue for Florida, not just in this matchup, but for the entirety of this pool, is going to be possibly relying on search and destroys, right? You can't really rely on those versus FaZe. You can't really rely on those versus the Empire. They're going to have to get respawn wins, and I feel like it's not going to be consistent enough. I'll say I trust FaZe maybe more in a respawn versus this recent Mutineer team than I trust this recent Mutineer team in a search and destroy versus FaZe. So I think for that reason, I'm going to go FaZe here. But again, Florida, they've won this their last 2 times, and I think they really could send this one the entire way. I'm still going to give FaZe the edge here, but Florida, I think most recently they look sloppy. I think they're going to have to really kind of slow the game down a little bit for me to kind of think that they can show some signs of life. It's going to be weird, right? It's going to be kind of strange for me to predict the Mutineers losing this series based off of how hyped that they were. But I'll be honest, the last event, it really started to worry me a little bit. The Game 5 round 11s that they had, the reverse sweep loss where they're kind of losing modes that they previously didn't. I'm not sure if they just weren't super well equipped for the meta or what really the case is going to be. But like I said, I'm going with Atlanta for this one, which will make my seeds. I have Dallas Empire coming out in the first, Atlanta FaZe coming out in the second. Again, it's not easy to predict this group, by far one of, if not the most difficult group of the entire year. Feel free in the YouTube comments to let me know what your first seed and your second seed, maybe things that I didn't bring up, you know, a few points here and there that you want to kind of emphasize. Feel free to do so. But again, first seed is massive for this group, kind of for the future of this particular event, as well as for champs as well. It's going to be fun. And like I said, this group regardless is going to be intense and is going to dramatically change up things ahead of champs.